Hello and welcome to the brewery. Today I'm making a Belgian double, but that's not really what we're going to talk about today. That's for another video in the future. What I'm going to talk about today is something I did yesterday. So yesterday I took part in a very large online coffee tasting. This is something I'd never done before. This was being run by a guy who works in a coffee company, but also has a online YouTube channel about coffee that I will link to up there. So what I'm going to talk about is the similarities and differences between the process of tasting beer, in this case BJCP beer judging, and tasting coffee, as we tried yesterday. So let's start with talking about the process. So for beer judging, you tend to have very little actual prep, alright, setting up the beers and blinding them and getting them ready. But obviously the beer's already been made. With coffee tasting, you've got some beans. So obviously the first thing that you need to do is grind the beans. This is probably quite similar to the start of all grain brewing. The whole coffee making process is really quite similar to mashing beer. So you grind the beans to a particular coarseness, trying to be the same all the way through. I'm sure experts can tell you exactly why it's a particular fineness of grind for coffee. Different processes seem to prefer different grind sizes, I think. But for this thing we did yesterday, they sent us a sample just to show you how ground it should be. Then you put it in a cup. Ready, you just put the actual coffee grounds in a cup, which is quite different from actually normally making coffee, so that was quite interesting. And then you also make up some special water. So for this event, as well as a set of coffees, we got some water salts to add to distilled or RO water. Fortunately, I have an RO water system, which made this quite simple. So once again, similar to setting up your strike water for brewing. Unfortunately, the samples we got didn't tell us what the chemicals were. Well, they told us what there was obviously what the ions were, but not the amounts. So the first step was just to, smell the ground coffee, which was quite interesting. There was quite a wide variety of things, and I could pull out lots of aromas that are similar to those in beer tasting. We'll come back to those in a second. The next part of the process is obviously to add your boiled water to all of them, a measured amount, to a measured amount of coffee. In this case it was 12 grams of coffee and 200 ml of water. If you're really professional at this, you'd have special coffee tasting bowls, but I just had some mugs I happen to have. At this point, obviously the coffee's going to be very hot because you just added boiling water to it. So you could go for the aroma again, but then you have to wait for a while for it to cool down to a reasonable temperature. Then the first thing you do after about 4 minutes is give it a quick stir, a sort of gentle stirry thing to knock the floating coffee down to the bottom, at which point it's supposed to stop brewing. So I think it probably does. After that, you do a complicated thing with spoons to remove some foam from the top, and then you start tasting it. And in this case, this is where another difference comes. With the coffee tasting, you scoop up the coffee in a spoon and slurp it really strongly. There seems to be a thing in coffee tasting about high aeration of the coffee as you taste it, to get a lot of air into it. I'm not sure this makes a huge amount of difference to the flavour. It makes a difference to the aromas you get as you're tasting it. And it's similar in some ways to what we do with beer, but we don't tend to slurp it quite so loudly or use a spoon. So the primary difference in the tasting process for coffee over beer is that with beer you're tasting a flight, so one beer after another, whereas with coffee you're tasting them all simultaneously and going through the various pieces of effectively the score sheet one at a time for all the coffees. So you go through the aroma for all of the coffees, then the acidity, and then the sweetness, then the flavour, then the body. I think this is primarily because it's a hot drink, and therefore you've brewed it and they're all changing temperature at the same time, so you're getting a consistent experience between the different coffees. And so onto the actual tasting process and experience. The scoring and evaluation process is really quite similar. The score sheet that we were provided for coffee has a lot of similarities to a BJCP slider score sheet, in that there are effectively sliders for the quantity and quality, which is a little bit interesting, of various sensations of tasting the coffee. with aroma, acidity, sweetness, flavour and body. The fact it splits out acidity and sweetness from the rest of the flavour is different, but it is such a focus in coffee that I suppose it's appropriate. The levels and differences in flavour that you get with coffee seem to be much smaller in variation than with beer, with quite subtle variations, as being what I could detect in all but one case. This may be that I'm less used to pulling out these flavours and flavour differences, but it did seem to be a marked difference. The actual flavours you're getting are in many ways quite similar to beer, though once again the range is smaller. There is a wide range of fruit and floral flavours you can pull out, along with obviously your toasty, roasty ones, your sweets, your sort of marshmallows, your chocolates. Obviously you don't use the description of coffee because you're drinking coffee, obviously. With the sort of craft coffees we were tasting, you tend to be focused around a number of fruit flavours, so berries and citrus and even tropical fruits in some cases, with less focus on the really strong roasty flavours, though one of the coffees they gave us was a different type of bean. It comes from a different version of the plant. I believe it's called Robusta as opposed to Arabica or something like that for the normal one, and this was very different. This was more like coffee shop coffee, very roasty, and you probably needed milk and sugar to make it any good, but it was interesting to try something that radically different. One of the things I found quite interesting was in one of the coffees I tasted what I would call in beer a Brett note, a sort of Brettanomyces yeasty note, so the bits of leather, sometimes called barnyard, and similar flavours that you normally associate with wild yeast. This coffee, it turns out, was processed by means called natural, where the bean and its surrounding fruit are fermented before the coffee is roast. So it seems possible that there was actually Brettanomyces in this fermentation that was providing those flavours, which I thought was quite interesting. Overall, I would recommend having a go at tasting coffee to anyone who enjoys tasting beer, and definitely to all beer judges. It's an interesting, contrasting experience with some strong similarities and some differences, and certainly will widen the range of flavours you can pull out of beer, if nothing else. Well, thank you very much. I hook that was interesting and informative, and I will see you, probably with this beer, in another video.